Hello, and welcome to this Quincy Institute book talk on the history of the drug war in Mexico. My name is Sarang Shidore. I'm the director of the Global South program here at the Quincy Institute. We are a foreign policy think tank based in Washington, and we promote ideas that aim to move the United States away from endless war and towards more diplomacy, more economic engagement, and all in the spirit of realist restraint. The Global South program, which I direct at the Quincy Institute, aims to achieve a new bargain between the United States and this meta region stretching from Mexico City to Manila. The program recognizes the Global South's instinct for multi-alignment and aims to build mutually productive relations in the national interest. The designation of Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and calls to deploy U.S. military forces to Mexico are just the latest developments in the complex U.S. Mexico relationship. Since the 1980s, the United States has provided billions of dollars in military and police assistance to help Mexico stem the flow of drugs across the border. This support for militarized drug policing has left an enduring mark on the country's security landscape, yet has done little to stop the illicit narcotics like fentanyl from killing thousands of Americans. As a top U.S. trade partner with whom the U.S. shares a vast border, Mexico is a key partner for U.S. counternarcotics objectives and crime-fighting objectives, yet the tensions resulting from decades of mutual securitization offer some broader lessons for U.S. drug policy and security cooperation in Latin America. A new book titled Policing on Drugs, The United States, Mexico, and the Origins of the Modern Drug War, 1969 to 2000, authored by Eileen Teague, traces the history of the U.S. drug war in and with Mexico from 1969 to 2000, casting new light on the impacts and significance of this bilateral effort. To tell us all about the book, we have the author of the book herself, Eileen Teague. Eileen, welcome to the Quincy Institute and our conversation today.
It's wonderful to be here, Sarang. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. And before we get started with our conversation proper, let me first tell our viewers something about you. You, of course, are a non-resident fellow here at the Quincy Institute. You have been one for some time. But you're also assistant professor in the International Affairs Department at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service. You previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, and also held a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University's, and all this after earning your PhD in history from Vanderbilt University in 2018. So I'm looking forward to a really interesting and productive conversation today, Eileen.
As am I.
Great. So note to the viewers today, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box because we will be coming around to including you in the conversation shortly. But to start off, Eileen, let's start a little bit chronologically right at the beginning. And let me go back, as your book narrates, back to the presidency of Richard Nixon. And he had an operation, a security operation called Operation Intercept, which was the beginning of this entire story that you're telling. So tell us what this operation involved and how it shaped bilateral anti-drug efforts.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the book itself, the mission, if you will, of the book is to tell the story of how Mexico and the US's narcotics collaboration evolved over time. I mean, a lot of times the entry point is that a lot of times we situate Mexico's drug war as sort of coming out of a vacuum in the early 21st century. And the premise of the book is that you kind of have to go back a lot further to understand how these situations, these collaborations evolved and how they helped produce and sort of legitimate violence in drug enforcement. And so as you asked, Sarang, like the book starts with, and the periodization is based around Operation Intercept of 1969, which is this operation in which the United States closes down the border with Mexico in order um, to, I mean, there's different words that you can use here: co-opt, coerce, force, pressure Mexico into adopting more intensive anti-drug policies with U.S. assistance. And so Mexico at this point wasn't the primary drug supplier to the United States. To the extent that we were seeing heroin deaths in the United States, the fentanyl was, or sorry, not the fentanyl, but the heroin was coming from the Turkey through French, Asia Minor, French connection type thing, popularized in that old movie. And this was sort of a pure white heroin. And marijuana was a source country to the United States, but it wasn't sort of heavily policed in Mexico. And so this really kind of changes the situation, because it puts Mexico at front and center as a drug supplier for the United States, and actually forces the United States to take stronger action against Mexican drug supply. And so, I mean, kind of going forward, this is a really kind of initial major thrust into the United States prioritizing supply control abroad over demand reduction at home. And while Richard Nixon's war on drugs, which was codified in 1971 afterward, mobilizing these immense amount of government resources for drug control, both domestically and abroad, it also did devote resources to treatment, not more than supply control, but it did. And it's really this story in the decades and years that follow of how it is that successive administrations shape what the war on drugs is. I mean, kind of starting to take off these treatment bits from it, more focused on eventually bringing in the militaries in both countries to police drugs, and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, so clearly the beginning, as you're telling the story, is heroin. And it seems like uh, your argument is Mexico was a transshipment uh, zone more than a producer at the very early stages. But then things start changing. So if we go to the next decade, the 70s, and as you lay out in your book, the war on drugs took a somewhat different turn in the 70s, because there emerged certain kinds of violent political actors or insurgencies in Mexico, which had political objectives. And these are not criminals in the traditional sense. They want to capture power or achieve some political objectives. And then the war on drugs gets a little bit diverted or complicated. So tell us a little bit about this complication that emerges in the 70s and what impacts it has, if any tensions emerge or otherwise, between the United States and Mexico.
Sure. Well, one of the arguments that the book makes is that while the United States was heavily focused on the Mexicans buying into its drug enforcement paradigms, at the same time, the Mexican government utilized anti-drug aid. I mean, some of which was, I mean, it wasn't just, you know, aid for policing. I mean, this was highly sophisticated weaponry, even in the 1970s in some cases. I mean, things that you wouldn't necessarily think that are necessary to police drugs, grenades, certain kind of automatic weaponry, that sort of thing. In addition to eventually herbicides, planes, and things like that that help expand in some ways Mexico's the coercive capacities of the state's policing institutions. And so the argument, one of the arguments that the book is making is showing that, I mean, in Mexico, drug issues really aren't so much of a problem. It's more policing internal dissent, and preserving the rule of Mexico's long standing ruling party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. And so I look at how there's sort of a slippage between policing for drugs with enhanced U.S. aid, and how the Mexican government uses this aid to police, for people. And this is particularly the case in periphery areas and states where drugs are produced. Now, I mean, yes, Mexico was a transshipment country for the emerging cocaine trade, but marijuana had been cultivated there since the 15th or 16th century, and heroin had been cultivated, or opium poppies had been cultivated there since the late 19th, early 20th century, when Chinese migrants could no longer get into the United States after the Chinese Exclusion Act of the late 19th century, and they found themselves in Mexico and in some of these highlands where they found sort of the ideal grounds for planting opium. I mean, so that is sort of the origins of how heroin is eventually cultivated, in Mexico. And so I think, but in these early years when the border was closed and you're getting into the 1970s, Mexico isn't the number one heroin supplier in the United States. And so I guess what I'm trying to say, and maybe to kind of even connect it to some of the values that we talk about with restraint, is what the book is doing is showing how these increasingly aggressive, prohibitive, punitive policies have these unintended consequences of creating more violence and actually making the drug trade more sophisticated.
Yeah.
Because in bringing the story to light of the late 60s and early 1970s, we're also kind of getting snapshots to the past and showing that the drug trade in some places of Mexico, the drug trade was part of local economies. There wasn't a heavy policing presence or a lot of violence, associated with it. There wasn't even a very heavy policing presence in the United States because of the drug trade. And in fact, from the 30s to the late 1960s, drug enforcement or the drug trade and regulating the drug trade fell under not the Department of Justice in the United States, but under the Department of Treasury. So once we get to this 1970s period, there really is these major changes happening in how drug control is enmeshed in U.S. foreign policy, how it's organized in the U.S. Governmental bureaucracy, and who is involved in policing, and then also in the rationalization for the use of force in this function that largely wasn't associated with the military and with violence as it would come to be in later years.
Right. Well, certainly we will discuss a little more a few minutes down the road how these policies have not actually achieved the goals and how militarization has all these, as you said, unintended consequences, and also put stress on the relationship, the bilateral relationship
Absolutely.
between the U.S. and Mexico. But just staying with the decades for one or two more questions. Let's the next decade is the 80s. The 80s is a very interesting decade because that's a decade when a lot of things change in the world. You have, of course, Mikhail Gorbachev's ascendance and a peace process that eventually emerges between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But before that, you have a bit of a spike in the Cold War in the early 80s. In the region, our region, you get in Mexico the first significant challenges to the PRI. I mean, you had the 1988 election when Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas presumably won it. At least there are questions about it. And the PRI is in some ways challenged. Mexico is going through a peso crisis in the early part of the decade. There are many turbulent events happening. And Ronald Reagan is also focused before the Cold War winds down on the anti-communist effort in Latin America with his support for the Contras in Nicaragua and elsewhere. And he also launches his own war on drugs. It becomes a big part of domestic policy. So we start seeing kind of the 70s entanglement between the political and the strictly anti-crime aspects of policy get even more entangled in the 80s, don't they? And what does that lead to in the U.S. Mexico dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question and framed very well because there's a lot going on during the 1980s and we can look at it from different levels. I mean, at the highest level, I mean, some would say that you have this renewed fight against, communism in Central America and other parts of the region that you were talking about. And by the end of that, some would argue that the United States' rationale for intervention in Latin America is shifting by the end of the Cold War from policing from anti-communism to counter-narcotics. I mean, so that's something that's happening at the Cold War's end, but also with the intensification of the drug war, the war on drugs under Reagan. We have this increased, I mean, before that period of time, though the United States coerced Mexico, pressured them into intensifying their drug problem, we still weren't seeing results in terms of the number of U.S. drug overdoses at home. And this happened with the years-long aerial spraying campaign supported by U.S. aircraft in Mexico called Operation Condor. I mean, all of these resources were being mobilized to spray drug plots, but at the same time that the United States was heavily concerned about the herbicidal program, there was this really intensive campaign going on by the Mexican army on the ground that helped to root out or police for dissent, and police for suspected users and traffickers. And sometimes there was slippage between those groups. And I think Operation Condor is the example of that. But, at the same time, we're not seeing a lot of success on the US side in terms of overdoses. And then you have stories coming out of alleged involvement of Mexican officials in the drug trade, which sort of paves the way for US anti-drug agents to operate more extra judicially in Mexico, being involved in some of the eliciting of confessions, through torture, and kind of borrowing some of the tactics that had been used in law enforcement by their Mexican counterparts. And this cycle then begins of U.S. mistrust of their Mexican counterparts, followed by a perpetual Mexican defensiveness. And so while there's a loss of faith on the U.S.'s part of the Mexican government's ability to police drugs on their own, we see an increase in U.S. agencies participating in Mexico, from DEA, CEA, Customs, and other organizations. And this leads to a really important moment in U.S. Mexico narcotics diplomacy, which is the kidnapping and murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena, who was working or was undercover in Mexico, and he provided evidence that led to a big drug bust in the state of Chihuahua. And I mean, and there's lots of conspiracy theories about what happened to Camarena, but essentially this is a period in which you're seeing these relations that are being undermined by narcotics diplomacy, or by this sort of perceived corruption. And so this is very much intensified. And conspiracy theorists would tell you that Camarena dug up that really a DEA agent probably wouldn't have been killed on Mexican soil. Not even criminal organizations would allow that to happen. But that Camarena might have found intelligence in which the CIA was funneling their product through or they were working with the Guadalajara cartel to get money down to the Contras in Nicaragua and other right-wing groups. And so granted, there's no evidence that has was the case or anything like that. But again, you see kind of this slippage again in which policing imperatives around drugs are kind of situated or entangled into the renewed Cold War that's occurring in Central America. And at the end of that, the war on drugs for that period of time comes out stronger than ever. From the Reagan administration on, we see even more, billions of dollars. This is when the anti-drug budget goes from the millions to the billions in policing drugs, both domestically and abroad. And eventually it sort of overtakes these anti-communist policing imperatives.
Yeah, very, very interesting. To the viewers, please drop your questions onto the chat. We will get to them in a bit. If you're feeling shy, just go ahead and drop them in so that I can see them. But this is a very interesting point to make about the budgets, because money talks, and the priorities are defined by how much government spends on things.
Sure.
And when this budget balloons from literally, you're talking of a huge increase there in the 80s. That's significant. Now, then the next decade, in some ways, I feel is a continuation of the second half of the 80s, in the sense that you get increasing The Cold War is ended, and you get uh, a very different regional situation in North America, in which Mexico decides that it's going to cast its lot with the United States in terms of its orientation broadly. So NAFTA, of course, is a big aspect of that, the North American Free Trade Agreement. That really embeds Mexico into an economic system that is North American. So in many ways, it moves from its sort of, it always was situated in North America, but it has strong Latin American identity. And now it's sort of more decisively orienting towards the United States. Its economic integration with the US is very deep. It's a free trade agreement, and wins are promised, economic wins are promised. It also creates major constituencies for openness as an idea, because trade, of course, requires openness. Free trade does. But with openness can come bad things across the border, can flow both ways, of course. And so to add it to the anti-crime efforts and the political insurgencies, you're also now getting an economic dynamic in the U.S. Mexico relationship. So, how does that new layer in the 90s start affecting the anti drug efforts?
Yeah, well, I guess one of the main arguments I make in one of the in the latter chapters, which encompasses NAFTA, is that to make, I mean, this was supposed to be this open trade bloc that was conceived of by the Mexicans mostly under the H.W. Bush administration, and it was supposed to pull Mexico up by the bootstraps. But Americans had a difficult time accepting that these sort of very unequal societies, could be part of an open trade bloc. And so the chapter looks at how the public relations campaign around making NAFTA more palatable to U.S. Americans. I mean, which included intensive border security and increased staffing of the border patrol, and things like that. I mean, there were compelling reasons why NAFTA was attractive to the U.S. economy, independent of the Mexicans, and the United States had similar agreements in place with just the Canadians, prior to. But this was supposed to be this expansive moment in which NAFTA would also, allegedly decrease Mexican illegal immigration to the United States because Mexico would be a fundamentally changed society as a result of interaction with this free trade agreement. But that obviously wasn't the case. And one thing that you asked in your last question, Sarang, that I didn't 100% tackle on is that by the late 1980s, you're starting to see this sort of dissolution of the PRI, the ruling party, with fraudulent elections, economic crises, and sort of what is going to be and the party being able to kind of have control over the nation in some way or form. And I mean, this really kind of comes to a head, and this is sort of the beginning of the end. What you mentioned as the fraudulent elections of 1988, allegedly, in which Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas allegedly won to Salinas de Gortari. I mean, this is sort of the beginning of the end, and NAFTA comes in as this, last bid at the going for legitimacy and trying to kind of improve the economic outlook in Mexico. But internally in Mexico, this really doesn't end up working because even a year after NAFTA goes into place, there is a peso crisis, and the U.S. has to again kind of bail out Mexico, and you have migration and the drug trade that are sort of higher than ever in the late 1990s. And one of the main things is here you can't have sort of selective boundaries between the U.S. and Mexico. It's like Americans wanted there to be open trade bloc on the illicit economy, but it was what the 1990s showed, or the latter parts of the decade showed, is that you can't have sort of legal open trade blocs without factoring in the illicit aspects of this arrangement. And this is why at another kind of very crucial turning point, the United States had destroyed the trafficking networks through the Caribbean, and a lot of the networks of the Colombian cartels that were prominent in the 80s and early 90s, and they shifted their routes through Mexico at the same time that NAFTA was going into play. And so this obviously had really important impacts on the drug trade, and the fact that then Mexican drug trafficking organizations were now, where they had been junior partners to the Colombians before, were now becoming senior partners since the Colombian cartels had been, extinct. And so to kind of bring it back to NAFTA, you have a number of these kind of forces taking place at the same time. And so by the time you get to the 21st century, the 2000 elections, for the first time in 70 years, elects the PRI out of power. At the same time that we're seeing the geographic locus of the drug trade shift to Mexico. At the same time, eventually with 9/11, that the dynamics of the drug trade become more dangerous given the escalation of border security that resulted from NAFTA, and then eventually from the intensification of border security that came with 9/11.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, 9/11 adds a whole new layer to the US approach towards security, non-state actors. Non-state actors suddenly become central, terrorism. But, as we know in Colombia, we had a nexus between FARC and the drug trade. And in fact, we have a question from Sydney Greenfield, which you sort of partially answered, Eileen, just now, but I wanted to give you a chance to add more points if you'd
Sure.
like. Sydney asks, can you comment on the extension of the war on drugs to South America and how innocent people were affected? So there's Colombia there, but are there other countries there as well? And what sort of links are present? You intriguingly mentioned how Colombia becomes a junior partner, in a sense of the gangs there do. But are there other things you wanna add to that story?
I mean, there were, but by the time you have the late 1980s into the 1990s, with the Camarena affair, you had it was the murder of Camarena. The DEA drug agent was um, uh, allegedly conducted by the Guadalajara cartel, which is sort of the grandfather cartel to a lot of present cartels, including the currently fragmented uh, Sinaloa cartel. And so, I mean, I think that this was a really important change in the drug trade for Mexico, because you have some, after the Camarena investigation, you have the fragmentation of the Mexican cartels, and where the Guadalajara cartel used to work with Colombia, increasingly it was becoming the more senior, partner. In terms of this narrative, I think that there's a lot of parallels between, there's a slippage between policing for insurgents and policing for drugs in Mexican society that really becomes, it's particularly resonant in the 1970s, but it definitely travels into the 1980s. And I think that in terms of connections to South America, I think that that's a really important one, and that the ways in which we police for drugs and the ways in which we police for guerrillas or dissent, sometimes what we might do to police for drugs has unintended outcomes for what we might do to police for people that are deemed enemies of the state. And I think that one sort of sub-argument that I'm trying to make in the book, which I think is applicable to the Colombia case, is that you might be successful in one, but then completely set yourself 5 steps back in the other. In terms of the narrative itself, while Central American nations sort of tacitly supported the drug trade, they're not a very big actor in my story. Of course, there's Manuel Noriega and other power brokers in Central America that were, dominant at the time. But I think that there's a pressing case for engagement for South America and the role that some of these nations play in the drug trade, more so after 9/11 and after the 21st century, and hence like sort of after the time frame that the book covers.
Yeah. You earlier you said something interesting, and we talked about the 70s. You talked about how Mexico started diverting some of the aid or some of the efforts into fighting insurgents, which was a domestic priority for Mexico against these non-state political actors. So, when we think of the US Mexico relationship, we recognize that there's a power asymmetry. The US is much more
Sure.
powerful than Mexico, right, in the bilateral. And the US is driving a lot of this drug war. But your book, that chapter certainly, and other examples also point to how Mexico uses its agency to achieve some of its own goals, or at least try to achieve some of its own goals. So when you look back at the 4 decades or three or 4 decades that you study in the book and you lay out, how much of this asymmetric power dynamic that is present structurally gets complicated by Mexico's own actions to take initiatives, to have agency, to pursue its own goals, which may not always align, at least in terms of the prioritization, with US goals?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I wanted to come across in the book is that, oftentimes in the history of narcotics diplomacy, you have it seen that the United States either intervenes or they're basically driving the bus when it comes with the imposition of the drug war and these more aggressive policies, and the ways in which the DEA operates in certain countries and the kind of agreements that the U.S. government takes charge in brokering with its drug supply partners. And what I really wanted to focus on is how, in many ways, Mexico also had a role here. More of like a weapons of the weak type format in some ways, but it wasn't just a passive actor in how it implemented. I mean, obviously, it Mexico acted within the parameters of this asymmetrical relationship, but they were also able to use U.S. resources to amplify their coercive capacities of their policing institutions. And I mean, in the interviews I conducted with DEA agents, more so higher level DEA agents, and they didn't even know this stuff was going on the ground. And so when you kind of look at this, when you're looking at it sometimes from the U.S. perspective, and you talk to the average sort of even informed U.S. citizen, they think that the drug war is this sort of like Mexican thing, and a lot of times Americans don't take into account how much it is that it's U.S. drug demand that is really driving the illicit economy. We're just sort of saying that Mexico is sort of uniformly bad and they need to be policed, and their policing agencies aren't strong enough to deal with the drug trade. But then you go to the Mexican side, and of course, what they're experiencing here is that you have this society that can't get a hold of its drug problems, that these are drug problems that are drug addiction problems that Mexico has not had, and yet has this whole other list of security imperatives that they want to address in Mexico. And so when you're looking at the ways in which the actions of US and Mexican actors come together, they're both acting, for their own, as a result of their own priorities. And when put together, both of them are contributing to the creation of violence and to the intensification of what drug policing means. And in the late 70s and into the 1980s, I think what I'm trying to do is explore, I mean, because the word cartel really doesn't appear in the discourse prior to the late 1970s. I mean, the word has existed, but it hasn't really, it wasn't used for Mexican drug trafficking organizations until that period. And so I think what I'm trying to do is locate sort of the origins of cartelization in Mexico by looking at how state responses in Mexico, particularly this war against dissent, when coupled with the intensification of the drug war, kind of created the conditions for these drug trafficking organizations to thrive in periphery areas.
Yeah. And we should mention that in just as I'm just going back again in time, but the 60s as a moment of origin for a lot of this. Also, 60s was a moment of great domestic turbulence in the United States. There were
Absolutely.
protests, anti-war. There were protests to enable rights for many communities that were not generally not focused on earlier, whether it's women, whether it's African Americans and others. And in Mexico, you had Tlatelolco. You had a
Sure.
major massacre in 1968 in Tlatelolco. And there is, a square in Mexico, and I'm sure you've been to Mexico City, seen that memorial in that square. It's a very moving year, 1968, and it also begins this chapter of taking on drugs as a security threat and militarizing the whole effort. There's a question from Harris Contos that sort of ties into what you just said about the demand side. And that's a very important thing that we often don't talk about in the United States. Two aspects of the issue on the US side of the border. One is the demand side, because you sell something, there has to be somebody who buys it.
Sure.
And the consumption of these illicit, harmful drugs is clearly not mainly happening in Mexico. It's happening on the U.S. side. And then, of course, the other aspect, which Harris doesn't mention, but Harris wants to know, what insights you might have on the demand side and how do you address it. Now, that's not a part of the book, but if there's something that comes out of your study in terms of whether Presidents Nixon, Reagan, and others paid attention to the demand side. Did they have serious programs on that, even as they were coupling that, they were prioritizing the sort of fight against drugs in Mexico. What sort of things did you learn in your research on that front?
The demand side, I mean, contrary to popular belief, there was actually a substantial amount of resources that Nixon devoted to treatment. And with shifts happening and the tearing down of the welfare state during latter administrations, particularly the Reagan administration, we saw a lot of these treatment forces or these treatment options being eliminated. Those that were sponsored by the government. And so I think that there's a lot of questions to be asked. I mean, outside the confines of this book of how it is that treatment for drug addiction in U.S. society historically has been stigmatized, and how that's affected the government resources that have been devoted to it. Now, there's the argument to say that, I mean, this is an instance in which individuals have agency and they are deciding to take these substances. But I think that the amount of money that we could have devote to treatment compared to what we have been devoting, over the course of nearly 4 decades towards militarizing the drug war. I mean, there's an important case to be made in which we could probably decrease some of the money for policing and law enforcement and redirect some of that money to treatment. And yet, currently, the current administration, with a lot of the federal funding cuts, even this year, as we're continuing to ask questions about the drug war with U.S. strikes in the Caribbean, I mean, you have a substantial amount of resources that were cut to treatment and overdose prevention programs by the government just this year. And so I think that this demand question, it's almost trite at some points to say that the war on drugs is a failure and we need to focus on drug demand, because there's ways that we can go further. I think our diplomacy with other producing countries could even just be enhanced by the United States recognizing that this needs to be a part of its foreign policy, that a lot of the illicit economy is driven by U.S. consumers. Because it's sort of this big elephant in the room with narcotics diplomacy, in which you have aggressive actions or rhetoric taken towards the drug trade and drug supply, while not even recognizing, in a lot of cases, that it's all because of U.S. consumers for the most part. And I mean, not all. I mean, there's also a thriving at times European drug trade, but and so you have these Latin American agents that you're asking to be a part of these aggressive drug programs. And at times using coercive actions. I mean, here I'm talking about Washington, while not even recognizing what, the heart of the problem really is. And you're asking for buy-in for these programs. And you're not even recognizing, in the case of Washington, that it's your drug consumers that are the basis of this. And meanwhile, you have these divides where, like in 2010, Ciudad Juarez is the murder capital of the world, and right across the border from it in El Paso, I mean, that is one of the safest cities in the United States, and it has been. And it's just sort of emblematic of these deep divides and sort of convenient denial of the realities of the drug trade and what produces it here within our own borders. So there's a lot of work that remains to be done with demand, and it's hard to reconcile not adding more money to treatment when we are moving 10,000 troops into Puerto Rico, and the USS Gerald Ford Carrier Group into the Caribbean to strike Caribbean cocaine routes, which aren't even producing the overdose deaths in the United States right now.
Yeah, no question. There's a lot there to be unpacked. Uh, just as we discussed just now, the domestic aspects of US policies. And by the way, I found it interesting that Richard Nixon had a significant treatment component in his budget. In many ways, he was a complex character. I mean, he's also someone who imposed price controls and wage controls and declared that we're all Keynesians now in the 70s. So it was a different time. But if we go back, sort of go across to Mexico and look at the domestic aspects of Mexico, Mexican governance, Mexican civil society, what sort of long-term impacts did the militarization of the drug enforcement by the US and Mexico together, but pushed by the US, have on Mexican governance and civil society?
Well, I mean, it's been a really important consideration in the bilateral relationship. I mean, I think that there's so many other important issues that we need to have our eye on today, like energy, water. But most of the issues that in U.S. the major issues in U.S. Mexico relations that we have time for are narcotics, migration, and to a lesser extent the free trade agreements. So I think that this whole story has kind of put these issues of the illicit economy, front and center. And I wonder, what other things we should be worrying about now that we don't necessarily have the time or the space for. I think that there's this perennial mistrust of Americans and their Mexican counterparts, and I think that underlies and undermines the current intelligence sharing that could be more productive for both countries. And the ways in which Mexican leaders aim to reduce crime and prosecute the drug war. I mean, even as recent as 2020, you have a case of DEA agents that are arresting former Defense Minister Salvador Cienfuegos at LAX airport, and the Mexican government didn't even know about that. And so I think that the way in which it kind of manifests in current issues is really entrenched in issues of sovereignty. You have the US or the Mexican leadership that is, for example, very passionate about having the right to defend its own traffickers. And so what does that look like to Washington? That looks like, corruption. But Mexico in some ways just tries to hold on to and protect its sovereignty in ways that it can. And sometimes that creates mistrust with its US counterparts. And so you even have in 2020 with the whole Cienfuegos affair that Lopez Obrador, who had no interests in defending Salvador Cienfuegos, who was the defense minister from one of his political rivals, but he sees this as a sovereignty issue. And so he's really upset that the DEA is arresting a former official without the Mexican government, not knowing. And so the drug trade in so many ways continues to affect governance in Mexico and relations between the two nations, to the extent that, recently President Trump, even just with sowing the seed of doubts with tariffs, could get President Sheinbaum to mobilize 10,000 groups of the National Guard to come up to the border. Now, were they really doing anything significant? I don't know. Many people think that they were not. But the ways in which other kinds of things could be mobilized to assuage or to inspire American action or Mexican action in fighting the war on drugs. I mean, this is what I'm trying to share with this book, is that this is sort of something that's been happening a lot for a lot longer than just these last couple of years.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And we are certainly in a different phase at the moment. And in fact,
Absolutely.
Lee Schlenker has a question for you. He wants you to discuss the recently created U.S. Mexico Security Implementation Group and what its priorities are and should be, aside from arms smuggling and intelligence sharing. And he would also like to know how this cooperation framework differs from Plan Merida. Of course, we should remind our viewers that Plan Merida was a major effort, bilateral effort that happened under the George W. Bush administration in the US. and a major war on drugs was initiated by President Felipe Calderon in Mexico in 2006 under the rubric of Plan Merida. So how does this framework differ from Plan Merida or the Biden era bicentennial framework? So if you could, add your insights on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I mean, I think that there's much to be determined right now about what the future of U.S. Mexico security cooperation is going to look like, and even what realistically that the security cooperation group is going to be able to achieve. I think that, I mean, Plan Merida was, I mean, the United States, it was sort of a replica of Plan Colombia, which was designed to, I mean, it poured billions of US dollars into Mexico between 2008 and 2020 to rebuild institutions, but it was also a lot of military and policing aid. By 2021, the Lopez Obrador administration had basically all but pulled out of that. It still wasn't even 100% clear where that would go. But then, that went away. And, as you say, Lee, that transitioned into a lot of the hype for the next stage, which would have been the bicentennial framework. And that technically still exists, but there was some meetings of it in 2023 and 2024, but it's not something that has really kind of gotten off the ground. I mean, that was supposed to be focused more on root causes, also on it was a step towards dedicating attention to U.S. drug demand, while also playing in and supporting the role of security cooperation and assistance as well. But that was supposed to be kind of pulled back from now. I think that there's still a lot of questions to be answered about the next stages and what we're aiming to do, because we are just seeing kind of what President Sheinbaum's security strategy is going to look like. I mean, she came into office in 2024. She wanted to hold on to, some of the vestiges of her predecessor, Lopez Obrador's strategies. Yet at the same time, we were still seeing homicide rates, go up. The administration reported that the Sheinbaum administration recently reported that between the time she came into office and May 2025 or May of this year, that the homicide rate of that period of time, based on that period of time 1 year prior, shows that there have been improvements made and the homicide rate has decreased. And yet the Sheinbaum administration was still very much in reactivity mode, both to tariffs and then to Republicans in August of this year talking about how they wanted to revisit options for using military force in Mexico. I mean, that inspired Sheinbaum to turn over 26 or extradite 26 traffickers. And then Mexico has sort of been on the back burner since then, and we haven't heard a ton of what the next chapter of these security plans are. I mean, meanwhile, even just in the last month, you've had several high-profile deaths of a mayor on Dia de los Muertos in the state of Michoacan, and a prominent agricultural activist also of the lime industry in Michoacan. And so what the Sheinbaum administration is releasing in terms of its progress, if it is progress, doesn't always seem to amount to the realities of what we're seeing with the homicides that continue to occur. And so I think that it remains to be seen, how effective the security cooperation group is going to be, who's going to kind of be driving the train there, and what we can hope to achieve, especially amidst all of these political developments that are happening at the same time.
Yeah, and there's been an argument that the coercive approaches, or let's say high pressure tactics by the Trump administration, have yielded the most vigorous action by Mexican
Sure.
security forces against crime bosses than we have seen for a long time after Calderon, of course, that era. And but there's that, and then there's the fact that we're not seeing any real improvements on the ground in terms of fundamentally it's not like we are winning this thing. And obviously the bilateral relationship is under major pressure. Mexico, many Mexicans are concerned, and alienated from the United States. And we are not in a happy, very happy cooperative place with Mexico, despite the overall management of the relationship that's happened. Nothing is cost free. I wanted to touch upon one question. I think it's a very important one, and then I have a wrap up because we are getting close to the top of the hour. But Joseph de Rivera has an important question about uh, these arms flows that go from the American side to the Mexican side. I think that's something Mexicans bring up all the time. In the US, again, we don't see very much of coverage on that. We just think of what's coming in from there. We
Mhm.
don't think of what maybe going from here to there that's making actually this war harder to win. So, does your book address that, or did you work on that, or have anything to add or share with our viewers on that aspect?
I mean, it's obviously a huge problem, and it's a thread that runs through the narrative. Drug traffickers in Mexico, and also people, I mean, Mexico did have armed guerrillas. I mean, there were leftist dissident groups and armed guerrillas, and it was the armed guerrillas at times in states like Guerrero and Michoacan that were using the drug trade to acquire weapons to fight against the Mexican state. I mean, you had this whole campaign of capturing the famed guerrilla leader Lucio Cabañas. And so, I mean, this thread kind of goes long in terms of US arms coming into Mexico. And the fact that by the late 1970s, Mexico is having to enlist US specialists to help identify the types of arms it is finding amongst criminal groups and, and people that are deemed dissidents of the state. This is not something that is a primary focus. I mean, it's definitely something that I acknowledge, and it's definitely something I acknowledge in the period after 2000, which is more of the epilogue type conclusion part of the book. But you're 100% right. I mean, I have talked to Americans that even just in Southern California that have made the wrong turn into Mexico, because sometimes I've heard of a number of people kind of getting confused when you drive toward Tijuana. And, what do they do? Because they're afraid of when they come back in, they throw their firearm out the window, and so I think that is just so that they don't have to worry about their car being checked and then being found with a firearm. Like I've talked to a number of people that have either done that or have seen someone who has done that, and I think that that's just a very small scale example of the ways in which Americans are not accountable for the firearms that are getting into U.S. hands. But also, and I comment on this within like a paragraph or two. It's not a focus, but at the end, with operations like from ATF, like Fast and Furious, where you're actually using weapons to try to capture Mexican criminal organization leaders, and that went really wrong because much of these weapons have not been found or traced, and the ones that have been found at crime scenes, to include one of a border patrol agent who was killed by a cartel leader about 10 years ago. So yeah, so this weapons issue, is huge. I think that with bicentennial framework, there was some talk about having that, be a part of what the framework was, because this is something that in Mexico, there's not really a weapons or a gun industry like there is in the United States. And even the people that do get their hands on guns, it's very difficult to actually go and find ammunition in Mexico. Whereas here you can go, anywhere and get ammunition. In Mexico, it's not even just about getting the guns; it's about finding the ammo for those guns, and that's why it's so reliant on the United States, for doing that. So, definitely a problem. And so when we talk about questions like from, even leaders here in the United States of using military force or, doing the job of drug policing or taking out these kingpins in Mexico. I mean, you have to kind of get to the full scale of the problem, and these cartel leaders are armed by U.S. made weapons, and so it's a bit hypocritical when you don't acknowledge these various facets of what it would mean for U.S. policing or military actors to get more involved in Mexico.
Yeah. So your book is a work of history, and it looks at all of these factors, these developments, this evolution systematically. And here we are now in 2025, we are almost in 2026, and the issue has become prominent again. Policymakers are wrestling with how to tackle this question. What would be your advice or your insights from studying this history into what has worked and what hasn't? If you were to advise the current administration on how to approach this challenge, what would be your advice?
Well, I say this a bit hyperbolically, but just to kind of prove the point that, like, technically, I mean, or historically, as this problem originated, drug trafficking organizations I tend to not be ideologically and politically motivated. And so, I mean, we see this term narco terrorist coming around, and people don't really even argue what or interrogate what the term narco terrorist means. And in some ways, for me, that kind of sounds like an oxymoron, because people who are narcos are not normally politically or ideologically motivated like terrorists are. And so I think from observing this history in Mexico over the course of, over 3 decades, um, these prohibitionist intensively militarized policies have worked to not only make these drug trafficking organizations more dangerous, but also more politically and ideologically motivated, more likely to take advantage of weak state capacity to create what people call these narco states. And so I think at one point in the book, I say that, all of this stuff, really isn't inherently more violent than the normal operations of criminal organizations in related to anything, but it's a story about how states made it that way. And so part of it is to the extent to which we can kind of get a handle of our own, drug demand, but the other part of it is finding ways in which to loosen up the criminal organization's monopoly on violence, which is what this has created, at this moment in time. I mean, it's about a monopoly of violence so that these criminal organizations can protect their trade. And so what would that look like in terms of tangible policies? I mean, I think that it definitely involves demand reduction at home. It involves working more diplomatically, not just bilaterally, but with other countries like Brazil, Ecuador, and others that kind of have a stake in these security issues and the amount of power that the drug trade, holds. And that way, if you have these issues of corruption or collusion in the drug trade, it's not just the United States, but it's a shared, it's a group of nations that are working together to kind of deal with a solution. And so it doesn't just get placed so that this issue is a fight between AMLO and the Biden administration, for example, but it's a regional issue to kind of deal with. I think that, as I said earlier, I think it's important that issues of U.S. drug demand and the fact that it's insatiable drug demand that's thriving the illicit market, that needs to be a diplomatic point that's brought up, not just something that we talk about here in the United States, but it's the bread and bones of this. And I think that helps buy in more trust into diplomatic measures. I think that restraint or sort of reduction of military force doesn't mean inaction or passivity. It just means not jumping to the military option as step one, which is what historically the United States has been, more likely to do, and finding other ways in which we can work. Because I think that the military solution, as the Mexican case shows, in more of a smaller scale than we see it today, gets us kind of a lot further back and than when we want to make progress. And so we need to kind of look at what the unintended consequences are of the use of military force as sort of the primary way of fighting the drug trade.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think your points are very relevant and valid. Restraint is not about pacifism. It's not about unilateral disarmament. It's about a sensible, rational policy that minimizes violence and achieves objectives and reduces risks for Americans and others. And from that perspective, clearly we are not where we should be on this challenge. And there's a lot of work to be done. So thank you, Eileen, for
Thank you for having me.
yes, sharing your time and your insights from this very important book. Congratulations again to this work, and I hope it sells lots of copies to our viewers. Please go ahead and buy the book and read it. And I hope to see you again, Eileen, in a future conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this conversation I suspect is going to continue. So thank you to you and to all. And folks who are watching, please always visit our website. We have a lot of events, webinars at the Global South program and other programs at QI. And look forward to seeing you in some of those. Thank you.